All right, thanks for this introduction. So I'm going to give maybe some more introductory remarks about my background that might be sort of relevant for the workshop. So slash a few disclaimers. So I was born in Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I live in Belgrade in Serbia. These are two countries that used to be part of the same country, along with a few others. This is called Yugoslavia, so in the Balkans in Southeast Europe. Sort of the process from one country to a few more countries was in a few instances very brutal. There were like wars, sometimes there were like peaceful separations, etc. But I'm mostly going to use the examples from this region because I'm mostly familiar with them. I'm going to flag some other examples that I think are interesting to maybe to research a bit and to prep more. Moreover, I'm mostly going to give some my perspective on how I approach these motions about post-conflict societies and generally basically these kind of motions. I'm not saying that this is like exhaustive things of a list of things you might consider or say or think about when you're debating. Just some things that I use that work for me and that I believe can be useful for you. Yeah, if at any point you have any questions or something like that, just feel free to interrupt me, though I will leave some time for questions in the end, etc. So firstly, I'm going to give some brief introduction to this region, just so that because I'm going to use some examples from that, and I think it might be useful. I've noticed that there are sometimes motions about ex-Yugoslavia, etc. So like I don't want to go into too much details, otherwise it will be like basically 5 hours me speaking about something that like going too much into details. Simply, Yugoslavia used to be a communist country in Southeast Europe that was like this Yugoslavia that we're talking about. That was created after World War II. There were some other versions before that, but what is important is that it had a few republics. Most of them were inhabited by basically South Slavs. So most people were South Slavs, meaning that we speak basically the same language or very similar languages, depending on cases, case by case basis. For example, people from Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia, and Montenegro basically speak the same language. Like there are no translators or like it's basically similar to different dialects of the same language. While on the other hand, for example, Slovenia and Macedonia, people speak some South Slavic languages that are similar, sometimes can be understood, but you know, and generally some of the cleavages that existed here were, you know, different nations that were based on different religions. So for example, even though that Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks basically speak the same language, Serbs are predominantly Christian Orthodox, similar to, for example, Greece or Russia or Bulgaria, etc. While on the other hand, Croats are Christian Catholics, while Bosniaks are mostly Muslims. So basically, the religion was important cleavage here, etc. And this country existed because basically there was this communist party that was, you know, the dominant party, and they pushed this idea of Yugoslav nationalism in terms of that we are all just basically Yugoslavs and that we are all the same, etc. And that, you know, the differences should be sort of downplayed, while, you know, our common identity based on fight against fascism, against you know, World War II, German occupation, and some other conflicts that existed. Again, I'm skipping some details just so that I don't push too many things on you. Basically, this was the crux of this identity. And the reason why they were relatively successful into pushing this is that they had one guy, you might know him as Tito. He was one of the founders of non-aligned movement together with Nehru, Nasser, Sukarno, and Kwame Nkrumah, if I'm not mistaken. You might know some of these names. If not, it doesn't really matter. So this guy was basically the lifelong president of this communist country. His birthday was a national holiday. There was a really like cult of personality that was very, very severe. And unlike many communist countries in Eastern Europe, and also like outside of Europe as well, this was not as severe dictatorship as, and there was no like direct Russian occupation or Soviet occupation at the time, meaning that people had lived, reasonably well lives. There were some, welfare redistribution, etc., and some of these things kept pace. But the problem arrived when this guy died, when Tito died. And then, there were some economic problems that were faced to, too much borrowing, faced with, having a non-competitive economy because it was a communist state. So like private sector was weak, and generally many people worked in state-run enterprises. And then, at this moment, given that, there was also this identity, Yugoslav umbrella identity that was pushed on people, but still people didn't forget about their other identities. Then there is a rise of nationalism, and basically this starts to erode the country. And then firstly, it was Slovenia that declared independence, followed by Croatia. I think maybe it was on the same day, but it was like relatively similar time. There were big protests of Albanians, mostly in Kosovo. And then afterwards, it was followed by Bosnia declaring independence, and basically war started there. So once when Croatia and Bosnia declared independence, the problem was that there was a large Serbian minority in both Croatia and Bosnia, and that this minority wanted to live with Serbia. And for these reasons, they didn't accept the independence of these two countries. Similarly, Serbia, that was the dominant republic in this Yugoslavia, also didn't want to accept this independence. And for these reasons, yeah, sorry, if people could just mute themselves, I think. Yeah. So, yeah, and this was the source of the problem because, Croats and Bosniaks wanted to leave, Serbs wanted to stay in the same country or to have like their own countries or more autonomy. Like there are many different versions of things that were demanded, etc. at different times. Not going too much into details, but then the war started. And then I think we can maybe start a little bit of some more general stuff that I think are interesting about the post-conflict societies. I think firstly is the conflict itself. And I think you need to understand how, firstly, it's very traumatic. I think these things can be important for you because you can use this to frame how people are basically, what is the mindset of people in post-conflict society. And let's talk about these conflicts per se. Generally, not all conflicts are the same, and there are many differences, many nuances, but I think there's some universal stuff about the conflicts. I think specifically about the, conflicts that exist within one state, some sort of civil wars or etc. Not necessarily the aggression of one country to another, but just generally, like often there are some internal conflicts in these countries. So the thing is that people who used to be your neighbors and who you went to school with, who, I don't know, like you met every day, etc., start to become basically your enemies. And maybe at the beginning, there is only a minority of people who, how do you say, are radicalized, want to go to war, believe that the other side is enemy, etc. But the problem is that the conflict, when it starts, this minority of the people start to become the majority. I.e., there is a huge radicalization of the population as a consequence of the conflict happening. And what are some mechanisms for this radicalization occurring? I think there are a few of them. I think firstly, generally people become, afraid. It's really traumatic experience. It is literally like you lived a relatively normal life, and then just out of the blue, there is a conflict, there is a war, there is, you're afraid for safety, etc. And like many examples, not only Bosnia, but maybe even Lebanon is a good example. It was like lots of different religions and nations living together, etc. And then there was just there were some skirmishes before, but it was just, generally stable society, and no one believed. I think if someone read some of the books by Nassim Taleb, if not, I recommend his books generally. I think there are many interesting takes for debating, but generally as well. So he's, I think, he does some job in finance, but he is also very literate in mathematics, etc. But he also talks about his Lebanese, how do you say, background, etc. And one of the takes is like, look, no one really believed and couldn't predict that Lebanon was going to become the civil war, and like there was a lot of, just people, you never tell it from, how the country looked like, that is going to lead to a complete disaster. But also when the war started, everyone thought it's going to be finished relatively soon, soon, but actually it prolonged quite a long time. I think it's also, Lebanon is a very nice example to for debate that you can actually Google and find more information about it as well. But in terms of the post-conflict society, etc., I think one of the problems of radicalization is generally just fear and trauma that people feel. But secondly is that, there are crimes that are being committed, simply because you just need to have a few radicals that, that are extreme, that are going to, hurt some people on the other side, either, kill them, either burn their houses. People leave their houses because they're afraid, because they're a minority in these particular towns, etc. And then, more people become afraid, and then you believe that you need to pick up the sides, right? Because there is one side that actually is likely going to protect you, the other side is going to that is harming you, and you're more likely to pick the former side. And then I think it's how do you say, I think it is important to understand that then there are no moderates here, because these extremes are just getting more and more people on their side, etc. But also the problem is that moderates don't seem to be able to solve the problems. And we can see that, for example, again, one example from Yugoslavia, it is a politician from Kosovo that was called like Gandhi of Europe, I think, and generally praised, especially in the West, for like wanting to have a coexistence between Albanians and Serbs. So his name is Ibrahim Rugova. And then he was like, you can just write Gandhi of the West or of the Balkans, and then you can find like more details. But what is interesting here is that he had quite a lot of support in Kosovo at the beginning from Albanians. But with the conflict escalating a bit more and more people dying and war crimes being committed, etc., people believed that these moderates cannot actually solve them, that they're not able to solve. And the extreme fractions are actually trying to solve the problem. They're fighting for you, they're ready to die for you, etc. And you appear that side is actually trying to, at least trying something, right? And then I think this pushed a lot of people from these moderates to extremes, which is basically KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army, which used to be basically known as a terrorist organization by the United States. Later on, they stopped seeing it this way. But it is interesting that, some extreme fraction that, KLA also did some war crimes, quite a lot of severe stuff, etc. They gained more popularity since these moderate fractions were seen as not able to solve the problems, etc. So I think these things you can understand that people, even though that, like, not all people were necessarily extreme, etc., but this is a process of radicalization, how it actually spreads when the conflict starts, etc. I think you can use some of this stuff to frame in terms of mindset of these people. And then these people are really traumatized, right? We often use this term like trauma quite a lot in debates in many different contexts, etc. But you need to understand that in this specific context, it is literally your closest neighbors. You perceive them as a potential enemy, as a potential, and like you lived quite a long lives with them, etc. So just to be aware of the trauma and what is the mindset of these people. I think some of these mechanisms you can use for this. And then in terms of the conflict itself, there is quite a lot of war crimes, because when you understand the mindset of these people, you understand that it is relatively easy for people to justify killing other individuals, right? And of course, like if killings are done according to some norms and in direct conflicts between the soldiers, etc., they're not war crimes, right? But there is quite a lot of killing of civilians for a few reasons. One, given the trauma and radicalization of many people, they simply have, they want to have some revenge. They want to have, lots of people, for example, they have some close relatives, family or friends who were killed by the other side. And then, they just flip and they believe that they need to revenge these individuals by actually attacking the other people. Basically, the logic is they did this to us, so we are allowed to do this for us. It's important to know that these are not, I think it's often misrepresented in the debate. These are not psychopaths. These are just regular people who became very radicalized because the context is just very, very extreme. Just to be aware of the process, how this appears even in people who appear to be normal, average citizens, etc. The second thing why lots of these war crimes exist is basically because of fear. I think you can see many examples here that people are unaware who might be the enemy, and then they're like, okay, better safe than sorry, or like better to eliminate these individuals because potentially they might be a threat, rather than etc. And there are few examples where this might occur. I think one is generally when you see male civilians that are being executed because simply, they're seen as a potential threat. They're seen as someone who can potentially take guns and fight against you, or they're seen as a potentially soldier who is disguised here, etc. But also, like, good example here to illustrate this is U.S. troops in Vietnam. You can see that quite a lot of civilians were killed by Americans because simply they would not be able to basically discriminate against their allies in Vietnam and their enemies like Viet Cong. And then often they just assume that, you're afraid that what these individuals might do for you, you would rather, be more aggressive towards them, etc. The problem is, of course, besides of that being a war crime and people dying, the additional problem is that this also pushes more radicalization on the other side, right? Because if you see that the other side is just killing indiscriminately or just being aggressive with this, etc., then the other side is likely to win. And then some of the other sources why war crimes might exist, etc., are some, let's say, structural reasons. Might be that you just have criminals, maniacs, psychopaths, foreign fighters, etc. Lots of people who have a questionable moral beliefs, or not necessarily questionable, but just problematic moral beliefs, that they are often attracted to war and to these conflicts because it is seen as a very potentially lucrative thing. So, for example, for many criminals, the fact that you're going to this was the case in Yugoslavia, the fact that you're going to be able to take over one village, and this means that you're going to be able to steal basically the lots of equipment, property of these people who used to live there, etc., and you'll be able to sell them basically with having 100% margin, right? And there is often this situation that is known in Serbia of these sort of voluntary fighters who went there and then they returned with lots of washing machines, TVs, etc., and they sold them because it was very, how to say, lucrative, etc. But also, secondly, because then these individuals, when they have a control over certain territories, they're able to have monopolies on trade on certain resources, specifically of oil, of some commodities that are very important. And also there are some sanctions, etc. So if you control the oil and the other side is under the sanction, you can sell them for a huge margins, right? So these individuals are attracted when there is this lawlessness, conflict, etc., which again further leads to more escalation, to more problems, etc. Foreign fighters, again, you have people who are just extreme that are going to fight here. So, for example, in Bosnia, as I mentioned, there were three religion: Christian Orthodox, Christian Catholics, and Muslims, three dominant religions that basically fought against each other. The extremes on all three sides came there to fight on their side, on the side of their basically quote unquote religious allies. So, for example, lots of Russians and Greeks came to fight on Serbian side because they all share Orthodox. A lot. I mean, there were some brigades, right? It's not like that there was 20% of the soldiers, but there were some brigades, etc. Similar, there were some extremes from Mujahideen from Iran, but generally also some jihadis going to fight on the side of the Bosnian Muslims, on Bosniaks, similarly for the Croats and Catholics, etc. And these individuals often are very extreme. They are more likely to do war crimes. They are not necessarily linked to this area, etc. so like generally, like all these things fuel war crimes. More war crimes fuel more radicalization, and generally just sort of scar these communities. I think some of these mechanisms can be, how do you say, important for you to understand the mindset of people in these post-conflict societies, and I think this can be used as some sort of frame to justify some arguments. To, you know, if you understand basically what your main stakeholder looks like, I think it's easier basically to build a stronger arguments here. All right. In terms of like, I think this is some things that you can get some examples in terms of how conflict sort of influence these societies, how it destroys these societies for long term. Obviously, these things go on to the next generation, because, you know, these are some like very dominant narratives, basically, that your parents that are under PTSD are going to just basically drop on you, and also usually the curricula also helps with this. I'm going to touch on that later, but yeah. In terms of the end of the war, often, so like there rarely it happens that, you know, one side is able to completely defeat the other side, and to, how to say, to have a total victory over the other side, etc. So that you have some sort of unconditional surrender, etc. Often, like, it's very difficult, you know, like these, to this extent, asymmetric warfares are like very rare, etc. Just simply, you know, it's just often it is easier to defend rather than to attack, and then, you know, at some point people will be able to go to some more remote areas, either like very large mountains, or like deserts, or like caves, jungles, depending like where you are on the globe, and then they'll be able to basically fight back. And then like also cities are like very difficult to capture, it's because, you know, like you can hide everywhere. It's really like a maze. So like often these total like defeats, when one side completely sort of, how do you say, defeats the other side, are very rare. Which often means that these peace treaties, etc., once they happen, have some sort of power sharing agreement. So it is not necessarily all the time. There are some cases when there are not. For example, Rwanda conflict, there, as far as I'm aware, there is no any power sharing agreement. So like there is a, you know, civil war, there was a genocide on Tutsi population that they were able to defeat. And then, you know, like Hutu and Tutsi are like basically two main nations in Rwanda, and then there is no power sharing. There was like relatively swift defeat from the side of the Tutsi. Paul Kagame, as far as I'm aware, is still the president of Rwanda. That's the guy that is the leader of the Rwanda forces that basically stopped and won the civil war. I think these situations are more rare. Often there is some sort of negotiation and power sharing agreement. Then in terms of the power sharing agreement, I think, again, there are few aspects here that I think are interesting, that you can use them in debates, etc. I think firstly, it is a question what is the trade-off with the power sharing agreement? From one side, you have sort of, how do you say, some more accountability, and that, you know, one side, you know, will get more one power, the other side will get the another power, and then, you know, you have these checks and balance. But the problem is, the other side is that, the other side of the coin is that you might have problem in terms of the effectiveness of this country, right? And again, I think few examples that can be taken from case of the former Yugoslavia, specifically of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, like there is no absolute majority of any nation. Right now, there is actually like things change, but at the beginning of at the end of the war, like the biggest nation were Bosniaks, Muslims. They were around 45% at the end of the war. Now it's around, they're around 50. The second were Serbs, around 30, and the third were Croats, maybe around 15%. And how to say, then these three nations. And what like you need to have some power sharing agreement. What they did is something is called Dayton Agreement, which has quite a lot of things in terms of how they are able to have this power sharing. Firstly, there are 3 presidents. I think one of the rare countries that has 3 presidents, one from that is Serbian, one Croat, one Bosniak. There is a huge decentralization of a country. So basically, you have lots of smaller areas that are called cantons, similar to Swiss cantons, but just quite less efficient, to be honest. That had quite a lot of autonomy. They have their own ministries of, let's say, infrastructure, education, health, etc. While on the other hand, Serbs have their own entity, basically, that is like one big, let's say, canton, skipping some details here as well. And then you have Supreme Court, where you have also some foreign judges that are able to break the ties, etc. You have this high representative that is basically a foreigner, and this at this particular moment is someone from Germany. But there were mostly people from the West were this high representative. High representative has basically the the authority to basically have some executive laws to change laws, etc. He's completely unaccountable, and he's there to basically help with implementation of the peace process, etc. And then you see it's like already very complicated. You have so many different divisions of power, etc. So what the benefit of it is that everyone believes that they get something, and you have a less chance of a conflict if people believe that they got something. But the problem is it's very difficult to get to the agreement, right? And then because it is very politically popular for someone to obstruct the the politics, and to basically talk about nationalism, about these kind of narratives about the religion, etc. So if you remember, in terms of the mindset of people, I think it is something that can help you to understand that politicians just when they have a chance to obstruct the other side and to be ineffective, etc., they're more likely going to do this. And this is the case, for example, with Bosnia, that you have a very ineffective politicians, that they cannot agree upon anything, that you have quite a lot of hung parliaments, boycotts of the parliaments, etc. For example, in Serbia and Croatia, this is not the case because there are no power sharing agreements there. You have a relatively homogeneous societies. So there are some minorities, but just generally they're minorities. There is no power sharing in terms of more areas, etc. And politics is more efficient, right? You don't have these decision making processes faster, etc. And I think it's an important mechanism. Whenever you have some power sharing agreements, etc. Maybe if you are propping the independence of one country or some territory from one country, etc. I think often what can be used as the mechanism is the faster decision-making process, and you can say this is important because just more things can be done, etc. And there is no these incentives to always be against the other side, etc. So one thing to note about these things. I think second thing to note about these things is that in these instances, usually it happens that none of the side is actually satisfied, because in case of Bosnia, I think that everyone has some problems with this Dayton peace agreement. None of the sides agree upon this. I think from Bosniak side, from the side of the predominantly Muslim population in Bosnia, they believe that Bosnia should be unitary because right now they are basically the majority. They have around 50%. They didn't used to have 20 years ago when the conflict ended, but actually, it was 30 years ago. Okay, yeah. But yeah, so it was they believe that the country should be more unitary. They believe that if country that these power sharing actually obstruct them from having much more power, etc. From the side of Serbs, the problem is that they don't want to respect any decisions made by government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc. They believe it's illegitimate. There is a independence movement, or generally just tendencies for secessions, which again potentially could lead to another conflict. or could lead to, how to say, general instability, investors not coming, etc. From the side of Croats, there is again a belief that they are discriminated from Bosnian Muslims. I don't want to go into details because it's very context specific, but there are also some reasons why they're also dissatisfied. They also would like to be usually either part of Croatia or have much more autonomy. So generally, there are also some nuances, but it will be very complicated to explain them now. And then none of the sides actually satisfied, meaning that often these power sharing agreements can be a short term in terms of that, once when the situation becomes again a bit more tense, you have a chance of conflict, etc. You might have, another conflict. But even if you don't have, the fact that there might be a perception of the possibility of the new conflict because you have these relatively, unstable power sharing agreements, because you have this politics that is basically influenced by nationalism, etc. I think it is the problem in itself because investors don't want to come into these countries. And this is, again, some mechanism that I think can be used quite a lot in terms of the challenges that post-conflict societies have, which is that, look, often the way for these countries to develop is basically to attract more capital, to attract foreign direct investments, for people to become more rich, more educated, therefore less influenced by nationalism, etc. And I think these things are problematic because if for investors you believe that these countries, firstly, ineffective in terms of that the laws take more time to be made, that you have more permits, etc., because you have all of these separations of power, etc., divisions of power, etc., this might seem as a very huge cost for them to come to invest, but also the fact that they believe that the conflict might appear, etc. This is again another reason. But also many people then leave these areas if they have a chance. You have quite a lot of emigration from these areas, and then also this is another problem, both for these areas because they lose many, the brain drain argument that I'm sure that most of you are familiar with. Basically, lots of skilled people are leaving, and they you don't have enough doctors, experts, engineers, etc. But then, secondly, the problem is that also investors believe that if people are leaving, that they might struggle to get workers, etc. Okay. So some of these problems that might exist in terms of why power sharing agreements, from one side it might prevent the conflict, from the other side they might have some challenges you should be aware of. And I think you can use them, for example, if you're propping for, I don't know, independence of one region in the country or something like that. I think you can use the ineffectiveness of these complicated agreements in these instances. Also look at the power sharing agreement of Lebanon. I think it's also an interesting example here. This can be interesting. Okay, before I proceed with the narratives and the role of the courts and international government, where I also talk about the TRCs, I'll just see there is another question. So what are the guidelines for studying past conflicts? There are often multiple narratives, such as the Western perception, the narratives of the communities in conflicts, and those of the opposing parties. How can one ensure that they are not falling into the bias or propaganda running on one side, studying in the wrong incentives of parties in conflicts? I'm not sure. So how can one ensure that they are not falling into the bias of propaganda? What do you mean about the bias and propaganda? Who is falling? I'm not sure that you as a debater, if you're not falling for propaganda. I think just generally try to get as many sides as possible in the conflict, and to think, and often, to be fair, the reason why I'm mostly using the examples from Yugoslavia is because I'm the mostly familiar with this, and I don't want to say something that might be propaganda for some other conflict, etc. But I think generally just to try to think of, okay, let's see both sides, and let's see, what are some things that are facts that are not disproven, what are some other stuff that might not be. But yeah, I'm going to talk about this, about the narratives and about the process right now. So in terms of the narratives and historical narrative, I think another challenge of the post-conflict society is like, how do you approach conflict, and how these people who were in the conflict should reflect on this conflict. And there are few approaches that exist, and all of them have some pros and cons. I think one approach that is often set as the motion, including at Vietnam Wars. So it was the approach that was faced in Spain after the Civil War. It was Pacto de Olvido, so the Pact of Forgetting. And the approach is basically in the name, like we just don't talk about it. We don't prosecute people. We ignore the fact that there was a conflict. And like the example for this is Spain. Again, feel free to research this example into more details. So some positive stuff is that basically you are unlikely going to reach some, this. So like as explained, there are many reasons why, reflecting back on the conflict might be firstly traumatic for people, but just generally leading to more nationalist policies, ineffective governments, a lack of economic abilities, etc. And then meaning that like perhaps forgetting might be a good way to deal with this. Some problems with this is that basically often individuals do not necessarily forget, and then they believe that it is just unfair to them, either because they see people who did war crimes that are getting into governments and just having walking freely basically, or just because they believe the state is just not talking about something that is very important and formative for them. But yeah, again, something that again we could have talked about this like probably for much longer time, but just generally some directions in terms of some pros and cons of this approach. Mostly there is usually some sort of talking about this conflict because it's so important, etc. And the problem is something that is also reflected in the question, that there are a lot of biases from the different sides. And a few reasons that you can see, like few structural reasons why this is the case. One is, as you can see, that different sides are like very so I think firstly the problem is that there are war crimes that are committed across the country. I think often what is portrayed is that just one side committed war crimes, another side was basically innocent victims, etc. Often, at least on some individual level, there are war crimes that are committed on different sides. And then the problem is that often it is much easier to you just find war crimes that are committed against your side as much more important because it's more proximate to you. You feel more empathy, you might know these people, etc. While on the other side, you feel more defensive about the war crimes committed by your side because you just want to have you don't want basically to believe that your side, your nation, your religion, whatever the division, the cleavage in these countries post-conflict is, that your side did some horrible stuff, and you don't want your side to be associated to this horrible stuff. And at this moment, people feel that their identities are threatened, and also can become more radicalized if you demand of them to basically to accept that the war crimes were committed. And I think often that there are like two examples that I want here to use for like two things. I think one thing that often is used, like Germany as the example, in terms of there are many things, like in Germany now, it is very embarrassing to talk about Nazism. Most of the people actually do admit that, there were horrible crimes committed, that, that Nazi regime was bad, that, it's despicable, etc., etc. Fair enough, but note that firstly, it's not necessarily, and like whenever it is not the case, it's mostly in Eastern Germany when, these policies of acceptance, etc., were not pushed that much by Soviets, and these are the places where like AfD actually gets more, how do you say, like Alternative for Deutschland, which is a far-right party in Germany, where they get much more power, etc. This is a relatively fair characterization, but the problem that exists with it is that Germany is a very specific problem. Firstly, in terms of the just scales and severity of crimes, and just being very meticulously written, like all the names that people who were executed, that you have so much evidence, etc. But I think more importantly is because the country was basically under the occupation from the West for quite a long time. They were able to write the constitution, they were able to oversee these things. There was quite a lot of backlash. It was a process in Germany itself. They were able to televise, the Nuremberg trials. So basically, people didn't have that much choice. It is rarely the case, really, that it's not the case in ex-Yugoslavia countries. It's not the case in Lebanon. It's not the case in Rwanda that someone comes as the occupying side and tells you, okay, these are going to be the laws. This is going to be education system, and to work for decades basically to implement this. I think this is the reasons why this is often a relatively extreme example in terms of why often people don't accept that much the how do you say, the war crimes, given that often you need to have a really quite a lot of circumstances leading towards this, right? I think more often what is the case, for example, what is the case in the Balkans, where lots of people would deny, for example, war crimes, specifically genocide. I think it's a very important thing that often happens is the deny of genocide. Like, people don't deny necessarily that murders were committed, that like some crimes happened, but like specific terms like genocide is often what is denied. And here, a few things that I think are important that's often misrepresented in debates. I think firstly, like, okay, you have a very extreme people who have, conspiracy theories and deny everything, etc. It's a really minority of people. Most of the people who deny genocides are, regular people, teachers, lawyers, plumbers, like you name it. And the reason why, how can they do it is like two, I would say three aspects are here important. I think first aspect is the number. And I think something that is often denied is the number of because what genocide has had, it has many people that are killed, and they're killed because they were part of, how do you say, a certain nation or religion or like whatever identity, and that they were killed with intention to exterminate them, right? The intention was to kill people from the part of the territory or just as a whole, right? And I think first thing that is denied is the scale, the number of people. And you say, look, the numbers are just inflated. Lots of these people were, for example, combatants that were killed in combats, and later they just thought that they were people who were committed, that they were civilians. This is not true. You see that lots of them are men. Men are, this means that they were fighters, and this is how many people will accept it, because it's much difficult for you to accept that your nation is basically connected to something that became a thing basically after Nazi Germany. Genocide as a low concept, and as a the part of some narrative, like it became much more prominent, and usually is associated with Nazi genocide against Jews, the Holocaust basically, right? So like you don't want to accept it, and like if you have this way, which is okay, like the numbers are just inflated, you're just lying about it, many of these people were combatants, etc. This is one way to deal with it. Often also what is the case that is different than Germany is that you don't have that many, detailed lists. It's just, like you don't have that much information that is really, like all the names, etc. Some people are just missing, or, it's much more difficult. The second thing is the intention, because if it's only a few people who are just, become mad and started killing civilians, this is not a genocide. This is just, few lunatics. If there is no intention to destroy another, how do you say, group, or to obliterate them, this is something that often is disputed. Okay, there were some people killed, there are some war crimes, but these are a few bad apples. There was no systematic organization and the intention to kill these people. So like denial of genocide is not like, okay, some of these people are these people who are just crazy, like they say, okay, Holocaust didn't happen, where the chimney is like, it's completely, a conspiracy, but it's the minority of people. Most of the people are just regular people who deny either the scale of the crime or the intention behind it. And then, and then what is the problem? Is like, because from the side that committed war crimes, if you become more radicalized because you believe that the other side is asking you to, how do you say, accept that you committed the genocide, which might be very problematic. And also politicians use it, right? Politicians, it's very, lucrative for them. And even politicians who maybe disagree and believe that it was a genocide, they will lose many votes if they say it was a genocide. And it happens quite a long time. For example, you have it in Serbia that like last year or this year, I don't remember, there were local elections. So like nothing relevant for, any historical narratives or something like that. And then you, how do you say, have candidates being asked, okay, what do you think Srebrenica was genocide or not? Because it was a very easy populist things for politicians who claimed that it was not a genocide to ask individuals, and then these politicians are asked, and they basically either have to say it was a genocide when they lose quite a lot of votes, because people just don't want to accept it, right, and believe it's very difficult for them to find this association of their nation with genocide, or they say it was not, in which case the other side believes, okay, even progressive politicians on their side are actually denying genocide. Everyone on their side dislikes them, etc. So like both sides are basically harmed with this discourse. And I think again there were some motions that were set about whether genocide as the term, as the legal term should even exist, or like whether it is a good or bad thing. I think part of the reason is because of this, right? Because this sort of crowd out all the other narratives, and this sort of becomes the problem that then it's more difficult to accept that there were war crimes committed, and then the other side believe that the other side doesn't accept at all, and they define their identity according to this genocide, right? This is the crucial narrative for this other side, and then this becomes more problematic. And then you have then the other side becomes more radicalized, and then you have this mechanism of radicalization happening on both sides. So yeah, I think this is another thing. And in terms of the court proceedings and the TRC, etc., and the role of the international community in itself, I think there are a few, again, challenges here that exist. So firstly, for international courts, one of the, like ICC, International Criminal Court, etc., one of the problems is like not all countries are basically signed, like the court cannot prosecute like everyone, or like not all countries decided to cooperate like with the court. So like some of the countries that did not include the US, Israel, I think Russia as well. So like lots of countries that, like basically they will not cooperate. So still leaders or members of these countries can be prosecuted, but the, if, the court doesn't have a like bounty hunter or something like that, they cannot get the leaders or even generals, etc. The second thing is that basically it is seen as imposition from the abroad, mostly from the West, because these courts are dominated by Western judges, and generally it is in the ICC is in The Hague. There was also a special court for ICC, like ICTY, International Crime Tribunal for ex-Yugoslavia, that was specifically targeted to deal with this. And then the problem is that basically whenever there is a decision that you disagree with, you believe that the court is biased, that you don't trust them, that it is charade, that it is political, that it is aligned with geopolitical things. And then you just don't buy these basically these decisions of the court. It's very easy to say just, okay, these are not our judges, etc. And then also there's also some bias, right? I mean, in terms of generally, like you can see in terms of the number of people from different groups that were actually prosecuted in these courts, that it often reflects with geopolitics of the of the West, right? So in terms of like that the Western allies are just less likely going to be prosecuted, etc. Then the problem in terms of the local court is again that it might be they might be biased for different reasons, because they are directly proximate here. They might or might not be independent, etc. There were some, you can still say that there is a oversight of the international community of the foreigners on these processes, etc. Perhaps it is possible or not. In terms of the TRCs, because yeah, someone asked about it. So TRCs, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, are so they look like that you have basically people from just mostly regular people, and then you have these trials where the focus is on admitting that you committed a crime and to asking for forgiveness and genuine forgiveness, etc. And the idea is that if you say that you committed certain crimes, etc., that you often receive much lower punishments. And how do you say that generally it is believed that this creates some sort of discourse between different groups that were in war or in conflict, etc. I think that there is definitely, you know, some logic behind it. I think this is the way why it might be positive. And the way it was, so like some examples when it was done, I think the most famous example is South Africa after apartheid, where you have these truth and reconciliation commissions. Again, I believe there are some reasons why this example might not necessarily be universal. I think in context of South Africa, so it's like a few things here. I think firstly, there's quite a lot of critique that often, you know, punishments were not as severe, and that often, you know, people who basically who gain from the apartheid still are like very rich, have quite a lot of that there is huge inequality. And it is true, South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world, that, you know, that you have people who have vineyards and like huge mansions and live in gated communities, etc., and that they basically didn't receive quite a lot of punishments, etc. While on the other hand, you know, there's a lot of people who are poor, who might who don't have access to all of the infrastructure, who that you have lots of crime, etc. And then, you know, that this inequality, etc., is basically because you didn't impose appropriate punishments on the people who basically profited from how do you say, from apartheid. Now, in terms of, again, still it can be said that, look, if you did, what might happen is that you might have basically a civil war between the white minority and this, that more people might die, that, you know, you still might have other problems why it might be done. Definitely, if you are interested in DRC, I think this is the example to look at. But again, some reasons why I believe that South Africa is unique is because I believe that firstly, there is a clear sort of there is a clear group for which it was quite a lot of gain if they just admit to crime. So like for the white minority, they had quite a lot of money, etc. So they were like, okay, we're going to receive quite a lot of, we're going to keep most of our money, we're going to still be able to live very privileged and luxurious lives, etc. All we need is to admit, etc. It was not as huge, how to say, a thing for them. I think for many individuals, maybe in the Balkans, etc., it will be that basically you admit that the other side is correct, that your side is actually wrong. And I think it's much more different in the context when you don't have clear good and bad guys, when you have different, you know, nations and religious, and it's a religion thing, etc., which is the case in most of the post-conflict societies. So I think this is the reason why I believe it might be, how do you say, unique to some things might be unique to South Africa. But yeah, okay. So I think there are a few more questions. Okay. So yeah, there are two more questions. I'm going to try to respond to them, and then if we have time, maybe have one more. But yeah, hopefully, so far it was clear. So under the post-conflict state building phase, how can we weigh the importance of negative rights, freedom of expression, religion, and positive rights, housing, healthcare? Yeah, I'm not sure that I have generally problem with this distinction. I guess that if you want to have more freedom of, yeah, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that this is something that is mostly unique to the post-conflict. I just have a problem because I believe that it is difficult to see how you prioritize one rights versus the others, what are some policies, etc. So I know that this motion was set, but I think it was relatively confusing. I'm not sure how I would approach it. I think for the latter, you will probably, for the housing and healthcare sector, you'll probably say, look, these are some things that are universal, that everyone will benefit from, and when they have these things, they become much less radicalized, more likely to have, you know, to be economical participants, etc. So probably that could be the way to deal with the positive rights. In terms of the negative rights, probably the way to wait might be to, how to say, to claim that, look, these things are essential for people's identities, and they're able to, they're basically happy to, you know, even starve for these identities, to die for them, etc. So basically, clearly, they're more important. And also, when they don't feel these identities are threatened, this is the moment that actually can peacefully coexist, etc. I think these are probably some way to, how to say, approach these two things. But generally, I think it's a bit weird distinction to have, etc. But some ways how I would approach it. So yeah, the next question in debates like these, one side often has intuitive impacts such as defending nationalism or cultural appropriation, which resonate more with the audience. What should be the strategy when you have to defend less tangible or more principle-based arguments, such as the importance of identity or the negative effects of losing a native language? Okay, so I'm not sure that there is necessarily a difference in intuition for, so like defend nationalism and cultural appropriation on the other side. I think that both things can become relatively intuitive. In terms of generally defending less intuitive claims, so I think that if you're aware that judges will not find this intuitive, I think what a few things that I think you can do, like in general, not only for the clause conflict debates. I think firstly is basically to basically address it, because it's like if you believe it's intuitive, it's like, okay, maybe we'll find this intuitive, but here are the reasons why it is still important and why we should still care about that and not about the intuition that everyone has. I think secondly is maybe to try to find some examples that might help to build the intuition for the judges there. So in case of some principle, let me see. If you just believe that, yeah, I don't know. I think that just generally, if you want to run certain principle, you should say, okay, let's see why, how is the way to frame this principle so that there is a to sort of touch some of the intuition of the judge that that actually might believe that our principle actually is something realistic. So I think generally the idea is basically to say, okay, here are some reasons why we believe that this argument just seems less relevant, but then here what is not. Maybe okay, one example that I can think of is like, for example, backlash arguments. And I think often like there is some stigma, like everyone does backlash arguments, but also there is some stigma against backlash arguments because it is believed that they're just basic argument, that there is like, it's always in the short term, there is always going to be backlash, etc. And I think what you can do is, for example, if you're running a backlash argument and you believe that there is some lack of intuition of the judges towards it because they might want to dismiss it or believe it's simplistic, etc. What you can do is say, okay, yeah, fine, this is a very simple backlash argument, but there is a very good reason why we believe this argument actually matters and has a huge impact. And just because argument is done in every second debate doesn't mean that it matters less. But also, secondly, I would try to say, okay, here are some impacts of this backlash, and here's the reasons why actually it matters more, like rather than what other side is running, etc. Similar to the principles. If you want to say that there is some principle, maybe explain how what are some practical stuff that this principle, some concrete examples where this principle manifests, right? So I think that try to, if you think that your argument is intuitive, try to basically bridge the gap and address this to a judge and try to persuade them that there is actually intuition there. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I think that I managed to answer all of the questions. Is there anything else that I did not know? I think that I did address all the questions. Okay, are there any more questions? Or I think we don't have that much time more, but yeah. In which case, yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone for listening. Here are some stuff that I told you that I use, and I think they're interesting perspectives for debating post-conflict societies. Again, there is quite a lot of things that not everything can be said in 1 hour, obviously. Hopefully you can just generally, if you're going to research, I think Bosnia and generally war in Yugoslavia, very good example. Lebanon, very good example. Partition of India, I think also lots of good examples from there. South Africa and TRC, some of the stuff that I think can be useful. Okay, thanks everyone, and yeah, see you around.